Hi, Year 12s. Today I'm back again with chapter 4, which is all about cook. As I told you, we are getting same story from different perspectives. So the multiple narrator point of view is actually trying to show readers a range of characters who are actually affected by terrible grief. So just like the solo performer in the seven stages of grieving, because we are comparing with seven stages, even though she is a solo performer, her role changes always, and she takes the different voices of different people. Same way here, Digwar is also giving us multi-perspectivity or polyphony. So Digwar here allows us in this chapter to hear the voice of much wronged cook in the shortest of all 13 chapters. This is the shortest chapters, one of the shortest chapters, this one. And here we enter the mind of a very simple, illiterate young woman who actually counts herself as being blessed to have such a good husband as Whitechapel, the slave. And we could see that in her chapter, because she constantly refers to Whitechapel as my Whitechapel. Many times she refers to Whitechapel as my Whitechapel, and that actually shows her love towards Whitechapel. So let us look into the chapter. After he laid his hands on me, I wanted to die. Whitechapel saved me. So she wanted to die after the rape, but it's Whitechapel who saved her. Again, the second time I had to tell someone, or surely I'd die. So it's about mention about the second rape. And there was no one to tell but my husband, and that's why she told her husband. And again, Whitechapel saved my life. A child not his, a pure wife no longer pure. Any other man would have thrown me away. He is no ordinary man. Look at the words used by Cook in order to um, show, in order to tell us about her much loved husband. And she says, he's no ordinary man. His master respects him. I see it whenever they meet. My Whitechapel got that hound of an overseer fined. He made him apologize, and to make sure it never recurred, he got him married as well. So we heard all these incidents. We heard from Mr. Santos Senior's perspective as well. So now we are getting it from Cook's perspective. Whitechapel did all that. My Whitechapel did all that. Again, acknowledges um, love, or she actually considered Whitechapel as a much loved person who actually protected her and saved her life. And now she talks us about the first time they met, or the first time they Whitechapel tried to get her attention. So to think at first I shunned his attentions. What did this old man want with me but to make me a widow at 25? So she was really frustrated, especially with Whitechapel, the slave, at the very beginning, at the very first time. And then it says, but the more insults I hurled, the harder he tried. So she started thinking all the bad words about all bad things about Whitechapel, the slave. But later, the more insults I hurled, the harder he tried. Whitechapel has been trying harder. And later she realizes that she was wrong. Where is that? We agreed he can love. Yeah, he can love, but later she realizes that I was wrong, that she was wrong, and she realizes that Whitechapel can love. He proves he loves me every day. He treats my firstborn as his son. We agreed never to speak again on the subject of Mr. Santos. And again, we saw this on page 34 from Mr. Whitechapel. Mr. Whitechapel says that all that was actually closed, like no conversation. This is the line, no one was to raise the matter ever again. Same way, we are getting that same concept from Cook's point of view. We agreed never to speak again on the subject of Mr. Santos. And never, and he meant it, not a word. Again, my Whitechapel is twice the gentleman. Look at all the phrases, chapter. Actually, it's a proclamation of boundless love. The whole chapter is actually a proclamation. It's like a proclamation of boundless love. And we could see the healing element of love. Love is acting, it's like a healing element of love. healing element of love is actually evident. Healing element. My handwriting is terrible, guys, on the screen. And then again, Whitechapel is my life. Look at this, is a pain to change the pen always. Sorry, guys. All right, back to the highlighter. Whitechapel is my life. I will bear him many sons. Every word he said to me during his visit to Mr. Santos to see me have come true. He said I should trust in him. So Whitechapel is asking Cook to trust in him. In another man's eyes, Santos laying his hands on me would have been a sign of my ruin, but not Whitechapel. Whitechapel never takes like that. Another man would have seen my pregnancy with Santos, forced a seed as an adequate cause to abandon me, but not Whitechapel. Whitechapel is not a person like that. I will bear him many sons. He will die contented. I will grow old with my sons alone and happy to have met my Whitechapel. So we could actually see the very optimistic tone. Could see the optimistic tone. As I told you at the very beginning, it's a proclamation of love. The chapter also highlights the reliance of women. The women, especially the slave women, is actually relying on men. Reliance of women on men, especially in that particular socio-historical context of the novel. Reliance of women on men in that socio-historical context. And again, part of Cook's admiration for her husband actually derives from a sense of relative power and protection. Whitechapel actually protected her, and that gives her a kind of, it's more like a love and protection that she has never got from anyone. And also he is able to defend his right and obtain some form of justice. So Cook got some form of justice through the help of Whitechapel, and that might be the reason why she was loving Whitechapel so much. Again, as I told you, the chapter ends with ends with Cook's optimistic tone. But however, we later really know that with Chapel's death, we later will actually later show that even a family's unlimited love has limited power over an inherently cruel system. Though Whitechapel is such a nice person, later Chapel's death actually proved that she couldn't live long and she was not happy enough and she couldn't see all those beautiful moments. So that's all about Cook's chapter, and it is the shortest chapter. Next one is all about Chapel, and Chapel again, this form of this chapter is different. It is written in verse. It is written in verse. It's terrible. Let me see if I can write it better. Verse. So it's I'm going slanting. Okay. So it's written in verse. What do you mean by verse? In poem. And why do you think Chapel has written in that verse or in that poetic style? That actually demonstrates his literacy and his creativity as well as his desire to cultivate his intellect. He wanted to improve, he wanted to learn, and that is actually that creative or Chapel's creativity you can actually see in this chapter. So the whole form of this chapter is in verse form, and again it's written in rhyming couplet. I don't know whether you have heard about rhyming couplet. Literature students would have heard it. Rhyming couplets. So there are so many rhyming couplets. Rhyming couplets is actually two lines with which actually rhymes towards the end. Children, where is that? It comes birch, church. So rhyming couplet. Leg, edge. Again, menu, neck, cheek. All these are examples of rhyming couplets. So he uses rhyming couplets in this chapter. And again, Chapel, we know that he's an intelligent guy. He learned to read and write. He longs to be a professional writer and poet. And he's very idealistic. He looks idealistically towards a very kind of a new social order, which is actually free from racism and slavery. Okay, let us look into this one. My father is the oldest man in the world. I'm his only son, not his 13th girl. So I'm his only son, though though Chapel is his adopted son, his only son. And then she talks about, sorry, talks about his mother. My mother is an angel without wings, fallen from grace. The sun has smoked her skin, but she is lovely within, a pure light. She has got a pure light. She is lovely within. Radiates from her. Though black, her soul is white. And look at the contrast, his opposition between the concept of purity and his mother's black skin. So he has got a contrasting. Why do you think he has mentioned that kind of a contrast, the pure heart and black skin? I think it's more like an unconscious embrace of racial prejudice. He is actually unconsciously, he is embracing the racial prejudice. Unconscious, it's more like unconscious embrace. Am I right with the spelling? No. Unconscious embrace. Unconscious embrace of racial prejudice. It's already embedded in his mind. It's a kind of unconscious embrace of racial prejudice according to which blackness is something shameful or degrading. So Chappell may have such kind of an unconscious kind of racial prejudice in his mind. That might be the reason why Chappell is using that contrast or opposing views about beautiful heart, light, pure light, lovely within, and then though black, her soul is white. So those lines, just keep those lines in mind. She is young enough to be his granddaughter, in which case I could call him grandfather, showing the age difference between his mother and his father. He watched me with his great grandchildren. Again, that shows the age gap, emphasizes the age gap between Cook and Whitechapel. He supervised our wash in the morning for church. He led us there and back with a piece of birch. Again, birch, whip with a birch twig. We will say whip with a birch twig like a stick from a branch of tree, maybe. So whipping, trying to whip kids, especially in order to make them to obey or make them to behave like slaves, which he slapped on his left trouser leg with each step of his left foot as on edge. All the way there and back, afraid to laugh out loud and talking in whispers, I was his calf. That birch I had to pick was never used on me. Never. It hung over me like a noose. I had no intention of putting round my neck. My behavior I knew that birch would check. I go on about the whip because I saw the way some children had their skin whipped raw. I could see some of the children's skin which was actually ripped through the whipping. My parents and other adults who bore no relation to them but saw to fit to pour lashes on a youthful spirit as a lesson for later life. Now, why do these parents do that? Why do these parents beat their children? Mainly to make them to behave like a good slave, to teach them that a slave should be like this. Otherwise, they will be getting severe punishment from the overseer. So, lashes on a youthful spirit as a lesson for later life. So, keep that in mind. Lesson, station, again, rhyming couplet there. Rhyming couplet. Rhyming couplet. Glee, me, rhyming couplet. Reason, son. My father chose another course out of reason. He must have got it from seeing the master with his son. So his father, Whitechapel's father, Whitechapel is using his intelligence, reason. How everything was either or maybe, not this is the way, or this only, not this is the way, and this only way. So everything must be done in one particular way. My father said I could not see by, though thought how the world was and would always be. It was a mistake for him to spare the whip, sweeter for him than to have my back stripped by the loveless arm of an overseer, deadly, shameless, vindictive Isaiah. So here he mentions again, it was a mistake for him to spare the wife, sweeter for him than to have my back stripped by the loveless arm of an overseer. So if the father is not beating him, surely he will be getting. Whitechapel wants his son to learn from him, not through the small beatings that he gets. Otherwise, he will be getting a severe punishment, harsher punishment from the overseer. So he doesn't want his child to have or to get that harsher punishment from the overseer. I love the days hanging on my mother's dress. She labored in the master's kitchen. We know that because she was a cook for master, who is Mr. Santos Senior. So many things. I'm just skipping some guys. My other schooling began with the youngest child. So the first schooling, whose was the first schooling? So that is the first schooling. This one. My father chose another course that of reason. So that is his first schooling. That's homeschooling. Okay. His first homeschooling there is happening there, especially with the father. And the second schooling is with the help of Lydia. Lydia is trying, master's child Lydia is actually trying to teach chapel. My other schooling began with his youngest child. She was 3 years older. She always had in her possession soft rectangular shaped books. What does that mean? Rectangular shaped books. Rectangular shapes. He doesn't even know what that is. So rectangular shapes is books. She peered at motionlessly for hours with no breaks. She called them books. Yeah. So chapel is not sure what that is, but she called them books and read aloud to me. And she used to read that aloud to Chapel as much as to herself to practice and say, "See, what can I do?" And you can't, until I asked her how for the upteenth time, and she agreed to show me how if I promised not to tell a single soul. So Lydia made him to promise. That he won't say this to any soul. So she called it the Bible. So she made Chapel to promise by keeping his hands on top of the Bible. And then one day she stopped me and said out of the blue, "Now you can read and you must learn to write too." So that actually reflects her defiance of racist ideology. She's trying to defend her defiance of racist ideology. She's trying to defend it, her defiance of racist ideology. What is a racist ideology? Racist ideology that considers black people as intellectually inferior to whites. So she's trying to defend such kind of racist ideology, and she's forcing, or she is trying to motivate Chapel to read and write. And the beautiful imagery, we are getting there. My hand was crab walking sideways and leaving crab tracks and sideways across the page. Then she held my hand and the tracks straightened as if the crab walked on 2 feet on line. So Lydia is teaching Chapel to write. I asked her to use what I asked her to I asked her to what use I could put reading and writing. She said I was a son of slaves and it was forbidden. So she is mentioning the fact that um, Chapel is actually the son of, or he's a slave. I asked her, she said, I was a son of slaves and it was forbidden because as per that, during that time, slaves were not allowed to read and write. For a slave, know how to read and write. Forbidden for a slave to know how to read and write. And what is again Chapel's view? What is Chapel's reply? I said it was a mighty waste of a good head. Again, that was a view that existed about slaves, and that's why Chapel unconsciously or unknowingly says that it's a mighty waste of a good head. She reminded that I took a pledge not to tell a soul. So she is again reminding Chapel that you're not allowed to say this to anyone, that I'm teaching you to read and write. I must have got lost in the image of her. I must have lost in the image of her. Or the story of two crossed, or story of two star-crossed lovers. Again, reference to the Shakespearean play, which play of Romeo and Juliet. So there is an passing kind of reference, allusion to the Shakespearean play. Whichever failed to hear the footsteps approach and only looked around when I fell. So while they were reading, they missed to hear the footsteps. We gasped aloud together. The book leapt from my lap, and we were statues with dropped jaws, waiting for her father to release the curse with his words. So who was there? It was actually Mr. Whitechapel. Mr. Whitechapel, the father, ordered Lydia to go outside. He drew his belt, signaled me to bend and shout at my peril as he lashed. So he lashed Chapel, and again we could see the racism and the brutal treatment, brutality towards a slave. I repeat, do not let me ever catch you reading. And that is the order from Whitechapel, do not let me ever catch you reading. Again, if you do, you will be sent away, far away to a place where slave boys die of hunger, hard work, and the whip. Do you hear? For your father's and mother's sake. I hope you do. Now go to your quarters and tell no one of this. Are you clear? So the anger of the master actually reveals that for all his claims of equality, he does not consider slaves worthy of becoming literate. So he couldn't accept the fact that slaves can read and write. So though he is a very lenient master, he couldn't accept that, and that too, having a relationship, having her daughter having a relationship with a slave is something that made him really upset. And again, the response, yes, master, I'm sorry, thank you for sparing me. I promise never to read and write. So he is promising, I promise never to read and write again. Thank you, I'm ungrateful. A wretch who deserves to be a slave. Again, he accepts the fact that he is a wretch who deserves to be a slave. Again, as I told you, that unconscious um, racial um, racial prejudice is actually embedded, or he's trying to embrace that unconscious racial prejudice that is already in his mind. And again, you could see the poem's line actually break down temporarily here. So the lines are breaking down, and it's getting very shorter and very condensed lines, condensed short lines here. Why do you think that is? Maybe I think it is mainly to show the artificiality of Chapel's obedient attitude. He's not a very obedient person, but again, he's trying to be obedient. So it's more like an artificiality of Chapel's obedient attitude. And at the same time, we could also maybe think that the opposite of that is maybe because the masters have got such a control. Masters can control the young, and especially Said can control the young boy's action through fear, through instilling fear. So these might be the two reasons why the poem's line actually break down temporarily and getting shorter and condensed. We don't know whether it's because of the fear that he is doing that, or is it his artificiality of his own obedient attitude. Anyway, at least we could say that he's honest. He's honest and had integrity, and he keeps the promise. I promise never to open a book or pick a pen. So that is what he promised. I promise never to open a book or pick a pen. I compose in my head or aloud. I write nothing down. So he started memorizing. He said Lydia was never to see me again. So that was the order from the father. We meet at night back to back. Again, look at the way they didn't see as per the order. They didn't see, but they met back to back. So it's more like a secret meeting. Secret meeting there. But he was a gentleman, and he didn't break the promise. He didn't see, he didn't write, he didn't see Lydia. They were sitting back to back. He didn't write. So without pen or paper, we talk, we speak from memory. So we speak from memory what she has remembered from books for me, what I have composed in my head for her, back to back in the darkness at this hour. Darkness, my father insists, anchors if invited into the port of an idle life. So Chapel's father, Whitechapel, always used to say, darkness anchors if invited into the port of an idle life, into a very idle life. Darkness I encounter, drops and anchors, slaves, inherit from the cradle to the grave. It is a ship that is unsettled from one view. Its anchors rust in us, its time it withdrew. So here Chapel's ideas are enriched and given a symbolic dimension by extended imagery such as the metaphor of darkness. So he uses the metaphor of darkness here. Metaphor of darkness. As a boat's anchor, that brings either positivity, or you could say either brings maybe captivity, either captivity or freedom. So the boat's anchor that brings either captivity or freedom, and that whether it brings captivity or freedom is depending on one's perspective. All of that is depending on one's perspective, depending on one's perspective. That is his philosophy. So he says that metaphor of darkness, he talks about the metaphor of darkness and as Bot's anchor that brings either captivity or freedom, and all that depends on one's perspective. It is a ship that has settled for one view. So it's all about father's advice and how he is taking that advice, and he thinks about the concept of freedom rather than the captivity which the father talks. And again, we could see again the advice of father. There are two types of slaves. Son, the first learns from mistakes which earn him a whip and fist. The second listens when he is told the facts, sees what works, what does, and then acts. Today I see you the first, not second category of slave. I fear for you, son. Again, we saw this, we heard this before through Whitechapel's voice. We heard the same thing through Whitechapel's voice. In Whitechapel's chapter, Whitechapel's voice, we heard the same thing where he talks about the two types of slaves. And here he clearly understands that today I see you are the first one who learns from mistakes which earn him whip and fist. The second one is actually listening and being obedient. So he is definitely the first one who is actually a rebel. I walked off shaking my heads at the abyss. Again, at the abyss, when you think about that word, he is referring to the abyss between us, father, jailer, catalysis. So he's highlighting, or Digwar is trying to highlight the distance or the gap or even the generation gap between them, Whitechapel and Chapel. Both of them have got different perspectives. So Whitechapel believes in, or he accepts slavery, and he believes that an obedient slave is a happy slave, whereas on the contrary, Chapel believes in freedom. And so that kind of gap we could see. I walked off shaking my head at the abyss between us. Father, jailer, catalyst. I had to leave. Mother took with fever. The weeks kept me there, nursing her with father. We worked but did not talk. I would lift, he would wash, taking turns at dark to sit by her bed and fan and feed her drinks and listen to her delirium, too tired to think for myself, too mad with idle death, toying with the woman who gave me breath. We were both with her when she died. I held her head, we watched her lips. We heard all these through Whitechapel's chapter. We cried, but made no sound and made no moves except to wipe our eyes and blow our noses. With her gone, nothing would keep me there. Father, I'm running. I feel joy, not fear. And now, at this moment, he actually says that, Father, I feel joy and not fear. I feel joy. I'm running. I feel joy, not fear. So, immediately after the death of the day, next morning, Chapel is actually fleeing, and that he emphasizes that I feel joy, not fear. Again, that is more like Chapel's idealism. We could see Chapel's idealism there. Chapel's idealism, or we could say that he was desperate. He was actually desperate to gain. He was desperate to gain liberty, or freedom. And when you think about it, it's more like a dramatic irony. That sentence, I feel joy, not fear. It's more of a dramatic irony, because what do you mean by dramatic irony? When the audience clearly know that the reader knows the impending death. The reader knows about the impending death, the death that is going to happen, the impending death of Chapel. But Chapel is unaware of it, impending death of Chapel. But he is unaware of that, and that is dramatic irony. So that particular line, we could say it's a dramatic irony. The reader knows about the impending death of Chapel, but not Chapel. So again, that actually heightens the tragedy, because we know what is following, and we know that he's not going to feel joy. Instead, we know that he's going to fear. So, and again, when you think about Chapel's idealism and as he is very desperate to gain liberty, and it's all because of his education. And that education that he got from Lydia has actually broadened his perspective. That broadened his perspective beyond the plantation, broadened his perspective. He started looking beyond the plantation. That broadened his perspective beyond the plantation boundaries, and that led to him to nurture hope. And what is he hoping for? For a very meaningful and a dignified life. Nurture hope for a meaningful, happy life. For a meaningful, happy life. So, broadened his perspective, and he started nurturing that hope for a meaningful and happy life. So again, here we could see at this part especially, it is more like Chapel cannot, or he will not allow his father's formula of becoming a contented slave or a happy slave, because even father realizes that he is of the first kind. He is a rebel. He is a rebel. He wanted to learn through. He is ready to rebel. He is ready to fight against this. He's not a person who is like Whitechapel, who is becoming contented and happy with being a slave. So that's the end of this chapter. So we could see Chapel's idealism, Chapel's hope, his love for his parents, and also we could also see his innate or his racial prejudice, which is already unconsciously embrace of racial prejudice. So keep all those in mind, and you could talk about the techniques like rhyming couplets and beautiful imageries and metaphors, etc.